Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. As he sat, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Arnie Luke's at the Crossroads. We've got an interesting day, an interesting forum. I'd like to welcome our forum guests today. Welcome, Betty Lukes from Adelaide.
Hello there, Arnie.
And Wallace Klinck from Canada. Welcome, Wallace.
Oh, hi there. We're basking in summer now. Unlike you in Australia, who are freezing in the middle of winter.
Yeah, we were talking before on the show, and it's worth bringing up. I mean, it's getting down to 4 degrees at night in Adelaide, and we think it's cold. And of course, Wally says at times minus mid 30s, minus 35, at very rare times, but occasionally. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, deep freezes. I'm not going to live in a deep freeze. All right. Our subject today, the Canon of Rightness. It's a continuation on that theme. And I'm going to just lay the groundwork for our discussion. In our history, our constitutional history, Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, common law, trial by jury, habeas corpus, there was a thing called Rex Lex. Rex Lex, the king is law. Rex Lex. And essentially it was an argument, this was the thing with King John and Magna Carta. It was an argument that the king is not law, that the king is subject to the same law as everyone else. And where we're moving to nowadays, and I'm going to bring up some websites here because I think they're most important. I've lost it actually. All right, I've lost the website. But the one I wanted to bring up was in regard to the new Despotism by Gordon Hewitt. And essentially the new Despotism and the passing of Parliament. These are books that are written, and what they're talking about in the books is that the function of Parliament is being undermined, and it's being undermined by the executive within the party powers and within the party groups, and that was the purpose of it. And that the executive would, and when I say the executive, the actual ministers who would minister to the crown with the actual running of government, they would minister to the Queen or the King. And the fact is that the bureaucrats and the executive are now controlling entire nations. And in Australia, we have the serious problems here with the executive and unanswerable executive. It's actually the elites within the party structure. And of course, all the hangers-on, not just the bureaucrats, but the advisors and the lobbyists who control this executive. They are actually running our country. And it's not coming back to we the people. The Parliament is losing its functionality. And this is most important. When we say Rex Lex and we say King John was pulled to order with Magna Carta, well, the fact is we have this situation now where Parliament is not being held accountable. That's actually incorrect. It's not the Parliament, it's the executive. It's not being held accountable to the Parliament, to the people. And they're acting arbitrarily, and they're acting as a power unto themselves. And so we've got to actually discuss this, because in it is a law of rightness. In it is a balance of things where the government is adhering to the natural law. In other words, they have a correct relationship with the community and with their own moral and ethical standing. They're adhering to the natural law. They're being a good government, whereas what we're seeing is we're seeing a bureaucratic or tyrannical or totalitarian government. And this is the passing of Parliament. This is the new despotism. And I'll let Betty move on from there. Betty.
Well, Arnie, C.H. Douglas, in his little booklet, The Realistic Position of the Church of England, warned of this state of affairs, and this was written in 1947, so it's quite a long time ago he warned of this state of affairs, and he reminded his readers that the Americans thought that the United Kingdom was still under feudalism because, as we saw at the recent royal wedding, the horse guards, to their great delight, still wear armour, and they've retained the titles of King, Lords and Commons, but in fact they abandoned the the concept, the feudalistic concept, at least 400 years ago. And the American colonists revolted against what happened back then because the Parliament saw that there were no limits to its power. And Douglas quoted a particular author who said, in rejecting natural law, Englishmen, that is the post-Reformation Englishmen, also denied the colonists' contention that there were metes and bounds to the authority of Parliament. The authority of Parliament was, in their opinion, unlimited. The supremacy of Parliament had come to mean to Englishmen an uncontrolled and uncontrollable authority.
Thank you for that, Betty. That's very important. That the American colonies rejected the supremacy of the British Parliament in the form of their rebellion against them. And of course, is it right? Is it right that Parliament is supreme? Is it right that the bureaucracy is supreme? I don't think so. I think there's a natural law that we're defying. We're actually defying, where Parliament is defying this natural law. Wally Klinck.
Yes, I think you're perfectly right there, Arnie. The government should not be it should not be an all-prevailing influence in our lives. Government is set up for a functional purpose, and it should be within the limits of its functions. Unfortunately, the way the financial system works, it creates so many stresses and strains and inadequacies and insecurities that we have resorted to government to do things for us, which it shouldn't have to be asked to do, because we should have a degree of economic security that would prevent that from happening. But yes, it has. Professor Harold Lasky from the London School had proclaimed the supremacy of Parliament. Parliament is just a functional thing that's got to be kept within its limits. It's and unfortunately, Parliament means to discuss, doesn't it? It's a word that means it's a place for discussing things. And it has become instead a place for sort of just rubber stamping laws and regulations, which often originate not from Parliament itself, but from pressure groups and influential groups, groups that have vested interests, which have power over the politicians and which induce them to propose legislation and to promote it for purposes that are not necessarily to the benefit of the population as a whole. And life has become complicated. It's very difficult, and we have big bureaucracies to deal with our governmental affairs. The bureaucracies have been trained and educated in certain ideologies and techniques. We have Keynesian economics, which has essentially come to the fore and become the governing way of implementing financial policy. And so here we have a situation where we have the party whip, who makes sure that the individual representative votes according to party policy, not necessarily according to his conscience and toward the benefit of his constituents. So it's become a very distorted sort of procedure and centralized power with policy emanating from centralized places and hidden places, which does not represent necessarily the desires or the benefits best interests of the people.
Thank you, Wally. That's a very good summary, and that's exactly right. Exactly right, that's how it's actually working at the moment. And I'll just highlight to our listeners and readers that the New Despotism, this work by Gordon Hewitt, is available from Book Depository. So if you're out there wanting to place this argument firmly in the forefront of your thinking, then not only listen to what we're saying, but make it your business to go out there and actually study the work. Now, the New Despotism, the passing of Parliament, these are very important points, because it's where it's gone, where the king insisted on being supreme. Now it is that parliaments, or at least the executive within the party systems, the executive within the party systems, are insisting that they are supreme. That we don't elect representatives. What we do is we elect a mob, and that mob essentially chooses an executive. And then based on that executive, plus the power of the bureaucracy and the lobby groups behind them, that becomes a dictatorship. And that's the despotism. That's what's being written about. Betty Lukes.
Well, Arnie, I think that we've got to go back to the prototype of what was understood from 2,000 years ago, and to see the development of the Trinitarian concepts as they were developed in the United Kingdom first, and then in the English-speaking countries, what were then the dominions. And Geoffrey Dobbs asks his reader this: why not consider Trinitarian terms? He pointed out that science, in the modern sense, couldn't have got off the ground if men hadn't learnt to think in Trinitarian terms of space, time, and matter. And the prototype, of course, is the Holy Trinity. And in this Trinity, none is before or after the other, none is greater or less than the other, neither confounding the person nor dividing the substance. And of course, we are doing all of those things now. And the organic relationship in the Trinity is so important. And social credit, of course, by the way, social credit, if you translate it according to the New Testament, what you have is faithful dealings. If you go back to the original meaning, the Greek meaning of the words is faithful dealings. And social credit must have regard for this relationship in and throughout every phase of our life. And that's what we are seeking to point out to our listeners. And Geoffrey also said it is the outcome in practice of thinking which carries the consequences of both life and death. And that sent me back to the New Testament, because I wondered what the New Testament had to say about as a man thinketh. And 1 Peter 3:10 says, he that will love life and see good days keeps his tongue from evil and lips speaking deceit. Or you could even go back into Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and they that love it eat the fruit thereof. So, if you like, death or life. And that's how I see it, that we've got to go back to look at the philosophy and the truths as understood in that last 1,000 years at least of English development, that they're going to see that out of all of that came Magna Carta, and that's dealing with what we're talking about.
Thank you, Betty. That's that's most important. What we're looking at when Betty's talking about the Trinitarian concept of the reality in regard to the people and the government. The missing component is since Henry VIII, the missing component has been the strong ethical and moral voice of the church, and that is the balance there, that the church should be trumpeting out the natural law, the canon law, the way things work most harmoniously. This is what we're looking at. This is the argument that's being set forth, and what we're talking about today. So keep that in mind, because it's we're not just, this isn't just a hypothetical exercise. This is looking deeply into the nature of what works and what is real. And what we're seeing today is a tyranny. We're seeing a monopolistic tyranny coming through our executives of government. That's what the party system was for, was to subvert Parliament. And in order for us to restore order back to Parliament, we've got to insist that this moral, ethical voice is resurrected. The phoenix, the dead church, has to rise again. and it has to speak boldly about the natural law, about the canon law, about what actually works and what is correct. Wally.
Well, that's right, Arnie. The the canon law was in the it was a purview of the church, and the church had its independent influence. It was its specialty, if you want, and it had to do with interpreting natural law in terms of the reality of things as they are, and simply the church had a very valid function to fulfill in human relationships. And I think that Magna Carta was a clear statement, a clear demonstration of the legitimate authority of the church, because the church played a major role in the challenging the king's unjust power. So that's a thing that has now, of course, the church is actually under serious attack, and it's more or less ignored in the area of government. Government seems to think that it can function without reference to the moral law and simply make up things as it goes, primarily in the interest of fulfilling designs for power. So this is a very, very dangerous trend we have here, because if you separate yourself from natural law, you are separating yourself from reality. And if you are separating yourself from reality, you are on a disaster course.
Thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. The we've got to learn from the past. We've got to look at what actually worked and steer the ship of state away from this disaster, because what we're witnessing is we're witnessing everywhere we look the breakdown of our natural human borders are being broken down, and there's this immigration invasion, the breakdown of the family. We're seeing that in the invasion of the state involved in the education and indoctrination of our children, sexualizing them prematurely. These are all natural order of things, and we're watching them being disintegrated. And of course, the outworking of that is the collapse of civilization, and that's what we're looking at. We're looking at our own civilizations just being torn apart. And if we don't do something about it, if we don't actually grab the bull by the horns and wrestle this thing to the ground, look to the history as to what actually did work and why it was so important that government is called to order. That these fascists in charge, these bureaucrats, these elites who are dominating us are not held to order exactly under the same laws as everyone else, then this is why it is. Betty Lukes.
Well, Arnie, we've been talking about law, and of course mankind, from observation and experience, knows that the natural physical laws cannot be broken, although we can work in harmony with them. As an example, when a man puts on a parachute, he can jump off a high cliff and just float to the ground. But without that parachute, then he just falls to the bottom and goes splat. That's the law of gravity. And I want to just read a little bit on the importance of the law of rightness that is running through the universe. The Bible talks about righteousness. We're talking about the same thing. The Old English term for it, of course, was rightness. And this law of rightness is running through the universe. Douglas described this as the canon. The stars in their courses conform to this law, this canon, and any navigator can tell you that he can chart his position on the trackless ocean by the stars, but he must adhere to the canon. When the farmer sows in season and reaps a harvest, it is because he observes this natural law, this canon. The engineer who designs an intricate machine, which, when constructed and assembled, performs the task he intended. He has conformed to this canon. And so even a painter would stand back from his work and could say, I have got that just right. This law of rightness, this canon, operates in every sphere, in human affairs, in the relationship between individuals, and in our actions we can achieve what we term happiness or satisfaction only to the extent we recognize, seek, and adhere to the canon. And that's how I see it, that Douglas, 100 years ago, was already warning his people that uh, on the wrong course as we were, then there would be disaster and this civilization was breaking down. And this concept of the canon is not new. The principles governing its operation in human affairs are not new. Seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, his rightness, and all these things will be added unto you. We're told that. And beside that principle, that basic principle of social life, love thy neighbour, we have this statement: every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. And that really is the importance of understanding this natural order governing human relationships. It's in the very fabric of the universe. Now, you think about that. That's quite mind-blowing. But I don't know how many people have even heard of this canon of rightness in this modern age. And I wonder how many have heard of it in the church for quite a number of years now.
Thank you, Betty. That's beautifully put. This canon of rightness is seek ye first. We've got to go out after it. We've actually got to look for it. Seeking is about looking, and that means that we've got to put the time and effort in order to even begin to understand what's being spoken of here. Now, I'll just remind our viewers of the significant resources we've got on our website. This particular article, Can Democracy Be Revived?, written in 1978, and it refers to the new despotism and the other work by Professor Keaton, his The Passing of Parliament. I just did a simple Google search on it, and you could do exactly the same if you chose to just go to our search engine and have a look. The Passing of Parliament, that's all I did from the ALOR website and our library. So I welcome you to go there and have a look and avail yourself of the resources. Seek it. It's there if you look. Wally Klinck.
Yes, there is a very serious problem of lack of balance in our in our affairs. Douglas said that economics is simply a functional activity of men and women in the world. It's not the end and be all of life. It's the matter of providing the physical essentials for life and cultural necessities or desires too, or resources. But our entire lives are consumed with the idea of work. Well, now, work expended for a good purpose is a good thing, but work that is merely expended for no good purpose is a very useless and destructive and immoral thing. And if we are forced to do more and more things in the way of work in order to earn financial incomes, to buy things which we already as a society have physically produced, then obviously we are going to be driven into a pattern of artificiality in our activities which are not necessary or which are even undesirable, like warfare. And so there's a dimension of our lives that has been denied us. We have been separated from the cultural and the spiritual by the obsession with material activities, which are quite unnecessary and often undesirable. This is an example of where we've gone so wrong in our approach to life.
Thank you, Wally. Thank you, Wally. That's beautifully put. I'm just going to touch on something here as to why I sing this song at the start and end of the show, Waltzing Matilda. And it's a story that Banjo Patterson penned, and it was put to music. And to me it highlights the unnecessity of work. These blokes, they had a swag, and they had to tramp from town to town in order to collect the dole of the time, because it was said that there might be work in the next town, so keep moving. And you could only achieve the dole or that payment at the time if you put your swag on and you traipse some 50 miles. And the mentality of the bureaucrats of the time, completely unnecessary. The work was more than enough was done. The people in the local community could do it. Why would the unemployed from that community move to the next town and from the next town move to them? It was just a form of slavery. You need to work, a puritanism of controlling them, and it's evil. And the fact is that in our current system, our current dole, you've got to have so many job applications every week, every fortnight. Report so many job applications. You've got to put on your swag and go from door to door and fill in the paperwork. Completely unnecessary. The automation is doing the work. The robotics, the advanced control, the technology is doing the work. And what we've got here is a financial system that is actually it's harvesting the increment of association, but it's harvesting it for the elites. It's not harvesting it for everyone, and that's the issue. And that's why finance is fundamental to what we're talking about. The law, the natural law, the canon law, the law of rightness is talking about inheritance. It's talking about sufficiency, a God of abundance, and yet we still see this waltzing Matilda mentality, this Puritan mentality of sending people to do things completely unnecessary. Betty Lukes.
Well, Arnie, I could just quote Elizabeth Holter in the ABC of Social Credit after what you said, and she wrote this in the 1930s. We go to work to get the cash, to buy the food, to get the strength, to go to work to get the cash, to buy the food, to get the strength, to go to work, and so on ad infinitum.
Thank you, Betty. That's beautifully put. And I think we've had a pretty good session. We're not far off the 27-minute mark. So I'd call for closing comments on this Canon of Rightness. Wally Klinck.
Just an endless circle of work. It's not a very optimistic view of human life. You know, it's really remarkable. Douglas really provided an answer in the concept of inheritance, the cultural heritage. It is something from which we can draw as an inheritance. Marx regarded work as the essential aspect of human life. It was just that the capitalist, in his view, was taking from the worker a portion of the worker's excess value. But Marx was obsessed with work, and it was, of course, at a time when the industrial period was developing and there were some very hard conditions. But he didn't understand, it's a doctrine of enslavement. And that is why, if you are concerned with work and work alone, everyone has to have work, then you have to provide work for everyone. And if you have to provide work for everyone has then a legitimate claim to work. But you would think that people would want to claim increasingly, as they can, a state of leisure and culture. So the Marxist idea is one of enslavement. There is no answer. It's a one-way street, and there's no escape through it. Douglas miraculously, in some way or another, solved that problem of ownership through his recommendation that everyone be given a share in the culture, the communal capital, through rights of consumption. In other words, the results that flow from it. And it was a remarkable insight, which turned out to be very, very consistent with the Christian concept of life.
Beautifully put. Thank you, Wally. Closing comments, Betty Lukes.
Well, Wally has said it really, and I just see it that we have to stop and think and look for that Trinitarian concept that is there for us to observe.
Beautiful. Thank you for that, Betty Lukes. That's wonderfully put. I'm reminded of the in our discussions. I'm reminded of young mums, and I know that they're being orientated, they're being herded into this feminist way of thinking, and the fact is they're being duped, they're being conned, because there could be this opportunity for them to have such a wonderful a chance of developing and grooming their children, the next generation, and of wholesome family life, and they're being conned. They're being conned. It's actually they're being sold a lemon, sand to the Arabs, or snake oil. Something is you need to work just like everyone else. I mean, why? When we've got so much automation and robotics and so much abundance. This is Arnie Luke's from the Crossroads. Once was a swagman camped by a billabong under the shade of a coolabah tree. Excuse me. As he sang, as he watched and waited while his billy boiled, who'll come a waltzing Matilda with me. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.